Story 1. The Echoes of Blackthorn Asylum. Blackthorn Asylum had been abandoned for over 50 years, but its presence still loomed over the town like a dark cloud. The locals avoided it, whispering stories of the horrors that had taken place within its walls. Patients tortured in the name of treatment, doctors who disappeared without a trace, and the faint sound of screams that could still be heard on quiet nights. It was the kind of place that attracted thrill seekers and ghost hunters, but most of them left with more than they bargained for. I was one of those thrill seekers. My friends and I had decided to spend the night in Blackthorn as part of a dare. There were 4 of us, me, Sarah, Jake, and Marcus. We'd brought flashlights, a camera, and a Ouija board, because what's a night in a haunted asylum without one? The moment we stepped inside, the air changed. It was colder, heavier, as if the building itself was alive and breathing. The walls were covered in peeling paint and graffiti, the floors littered with broken glass and debris. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. We started in the main hall, where the ceiling stretched high above us, its rafters obscured by shadows. Sarah pointed her flashlight at the walls, revealing faded murals of angels and demons locked in eternal battle. "Creepy," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. We moved deeper into the asylum, exploring room after room. Each one was more unsettling than the last. Rusted gurneys sat abandoned in the hallways, their straps hanging like limp, decaying limbs. Patient records were scattered across the floor, the ink faded but still legible. Names, diagnoses, treatments, most of them horrifying. Electroshock therapy, ice baths, lobotomies. It was a graveyard of broken minds. Then we found the basement. The door was heavy, its surface scarred with deep gouges. It took all 4 of us to pull it open, the hinges screaming in protest. The air that rushed out was cold and damp, carrying with it the faint smell of rot. We hesitated at the top of the stairs, our flashlights barely piercing the darkness below. "We're really doing this, huh?" Marcus said, his voice trembling. "We came this far," Jake replied, though he didn't sound convinced. We descended slowly, the stairs groaning under our weight. The basement was a maze of narrow corridors and small windowless rooms. The walls were lined with pipes, their surfaces slick with condensation. The air was thick with the sound of dripping water, each drop echoing like a gunshot. That's when we heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from one of the rooms at the end of the hall. We followed the sound, our flashlights shaking in our hands. The door was slightly ajar, and the tapping grew louder as we approached. Inside we found a chair. It was old, its wooden frame splintered and cracked. Straps hung from the arms and legs, their edges frayed. And in the center of the room, suspended from the ceiling, was a single light bulb. It swung gently, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. The tapping stopped. We stood there in silence, the air growing colder with each passing second. Then, from somewhere deep within the asylum, came a sound that made my blood run cold, a low, guttural laugh. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. We didn't argue. We turned and ran, our footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The laughter followed us, growing louder and more distorted with each step. By the time we reached the main hall, it was deafening, a cacophony of voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. We burst through the front doors and didn't stop running until we were back in the car. None of us spoke on the drive home. We didn't need to. We all knew what we'd heard. The next day, I developed the photos we'd taken. Most of them were blurry or overexposed, but one stood out. It was a shot of the basement, taken just before we heard the tapping. In the corner of the frame, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. It was hunched over, its face obscured, but its hand was raised, fingers curled, as if it had been tapping on the wall. I never went back to Blackthorn Asylum, but sometimes, late at night, I hear that tapping again. And I know it's not in my head. Story 2. The Shadows of Hollow Hill Sanatorium. Hollow Hill Sanatorium was built in the early 1900s, a sprawling complex nestled deep in the woods. It was meant to be a place of healing, but it quickly became a house of horrors. Patients were subjected to experimental treatments, many of which left them worse off than when they arrived. The doctors claimed they were pushing the boundaries of science, but the truth was far darker. The sanatorium closed in the 1960s after a series of mysterious deaths. The official report blamed a faulty heating system, but the locals knew better. They said the doctors had gone too far, that they'd unleashed something they couldn't control. Whatever the truth, the building was left to rot, its secrets buried beneath layers of dust and decay. I first heard about Hollow Hill from my uncle, who'd worked there as an orderly in the years before it closed. He never talked about it much, but when he did, his voice was filled with a mixture of fear and regret. Some places are better left forgotten, he'd say. Hollow Hill is one of them. But I couldn't let it go. I needed to see it for myself. I arrived at the sanatorium just as the sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and red. The building loomed before me, its windows dark and lifeless. The front doors were chained shut, but a side entrance had been pried open, the wood splintered and cracked. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floors littered with broken furniture and debris. I moved slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I found the patient records in a small office on the second floor. The files were old and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. Names, diagnoses, treatments, most of them horrifying. But one name stood out, patient 47. The file was thicker than the others, filled with notes and diagrams. The diagnosis was vague, severe psychosis, but the treatments were anything but. Electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, even experimental surgeries. The notes became increasingly erratic as I read on, the handwriting devolving into barely legible scrawl. Patient 47 is resistant to treatment. The shadows are growing stronger. It's not just in his head, it's real. I didn't know what to make of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around, my flashlight sweeping the room, but there was no one there. Just shadows. I decided to leave, but as I made my way back to the entrance, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the basement. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I should leave, but something compelled me to investigate. The basement was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of rot. The tapping grew louder as I descended the stairs, each step echoing through the empty space. I followed the sound to a small, windowless room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and the tapping stopped as I approached. Inside, I found a chair. It was old, its wooden frame splintered and cracked. Straps hung from the arms and legs, their edges frayed. And in the center of the room, suspended from the ceiling, was a single light bulb. It swung gently, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. That's when I saw it. A figure hunched over in the corner. It was barely visible in the shadows, but I could make out its shape. It was human, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid. It turned its head slowly, and I saw its face, or rather the lack of one. Where its eyes should have been were two dark, empty voids. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand. The light flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. I heard the figure move, its footsteps slow and deliberate. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The laughter followed me, growing louder and more distorted with each step. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car. I drove home in silence, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. I knew they wouldn't believe me. But sometimes late at night, I hear that tapping again, and I know it's not in my head. Story 3: The Forgotten Ward. The Ravenhurst Asylum had stood for over a century, a towering relic of madness and suffering. It was the kind of place where the walls seemed to whisper, where the shadows stretched too long, and where the air was thick with the echoes of those long forgotten. When it finally shut its doors in 1974, it was left to rot, a mausoleum for the damned. No one in town spoke of the asylum. Parents warned their children to stay away, and those who had once worked there took their secrets to the grave. But the rumors persisted, of a ward that had never been accounted for, a wing erased from the records, hidden behind bricked-up hallways. They called it Ward Z. Ethan Cole was a freelance urban explorer who thrived on uncovering the secrets of abandoned places. When he stumbled across a tattered journal from a former nurse detailing the existence of Ward Z, he knew he had to find it. The journal spoke of a failed experiment, of patients disappearing, and of doctors who were never seen again. Under the cover of night, Ethan pried open a rusted side door and stepped into the asylum's decayed halls. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing peeling paint, overturned wheelchairs, and shattered glass. The air reeked of mold and something metallic, something foul. The deeper he went, the more he felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing against him. Hours passed before he found it, the wall described in the journal. The bricks were old but brittle. With enough force, Ethan managed to pry them loose, revealing a gaping black passage beyond. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. Ward Z was unlike the rest of the asylum. The decay was minimal, as if time had stopped the moment it was sealed. Empty beds lined the walls, restraints still attached. Papers lay scattered across desks, detailing treatments that seemed more like torture. Prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, and something called the reflection therapy. Ethan picked up a folder and read aloud. Subject 16 has ceased to respond to external stimuli. Mirrors no longer necessary. The entity has taken hold. A shiver crawled up his spine. He turned a corner and gasped. The hallway was lined with mirrors, tall, unbroken, and polished to an unnatural gleam. At the end stood a single wheelchair, facing a full-length mirror. Something about the chair unnerved him, as if it were waiting. He approached cautiously, his breath shallow. The mirror reflected him, and something else. A shape moved behind him. He spun around. Nothing. He turned back to the mirror. His reflection was wrong. It no longer mimicked his movements. Instead, it stared at him, a twisted grin spreading across its face. Then, slowly, his reflection stood up, while Ethan remained frozen in place. His chest tightened as his mirrored self stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass. Ethan wanted to run, to scream, but his body refused to obey. The reflection's grin widened, its fingers pushing against the barrier, the surface rippling like liquid. It stepped through. The last thing Ethan saw before everything went black was himself, his other self, walking away, whistling an eerie tune, leaving him trapped in the endless void beyond the glass. The next day, explorers found the asylum's side door ajar. Inside, near the broken bricks leading to Ward Z, they discovered Ethan's flashlight, still flickering. But of Ethan himself, there was no sign, just the mirrors, standing silent and untouched, their surfaces reflecting only the endless darkness of the forgotten ward. Story 3. The Whispers of Willowbrook Asylum. Willowbrook Asylum was once a place of hope, a sanctuary for those deemed incurable by society. But over time, it became a house of nightmares. The doctors, driven by desperation and delusions of grandeur, began experimenting on their patients. The treatments were brutal: lobotomies, electroshock therapy, and something far worse, something they called Project Echo. The asylum closed in 1972 after a fire destroyed most of the building. The official report said it was an accident, but the locals whispered about a patient revolt, about screams that echoed through the night as the flames consumed the building. The ruins were left untouched, a grim reminder of the horrors that had taken place there. I first heard about Willowbrook from an old newspaper article I found in my grandfather's attic. He'd been a patient there in the 1950s, though he never talked about it. The article mentioned Project Echo, but there were no details, just a vague reference to experimental sound therapy. I was intrigued, and against my better judgment, I decided to visit the asylum. The ruins were even more unsettling than I'd imagined. The walls were blackened and crumbling, the windows shattered. The air was thick with the smell of ash and decay. I moved carefully, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I found the records in a small office on the ground floor. The files were charred and brittle, but some of the pages were still legible. Names, diagnoses, treatments, most of them horrifying. But one file stood out: Patient 23. The notes were filled with references to Project Echo, but the details were vague. The doctors had been trying to harness the power of sound, but something had gone wrong. Patient 23 is responding to the treatment, but the side effects are unexpected. The whispers are growing louder. They're not just in his head, They're real. We've lost control. The echoes are everywhere. I didn't know what to make of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around, my flashlight sweeping the room, but there was no one there. Just shadows. Then I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the basement. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I should leave, but something compelled me to investigate. The basement was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of rot. The tapping grew louder as I descended the stairs, each step echoing through the empty space. I followed the sound to a small windowless room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and the tapping stopped as I approached. Inside I found a chair. It was old, its wooden frame splintered and cracked. Straps hung from the arms and legs, their edges frayed, and in the center of the room, suspended from the ceiling, was a single light bulb. It swung gently, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. That's when I saw it, a figure, hunched over in the corner. It was barely visible in the shadows, but I could make out its shape. It was human, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid. It turned its head slowly, and I saw its face, or rather the lack of one. Where its eyes should have been were two dark, empty voids. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand. The light flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. I heard the figure move, its footsteps slow and deliberate. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The laughter followed me, growing louder and more distorted with each step. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car. I drove home in silence, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. I knew they wouldn't believe me. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that tapping again, and I know it's not in my head. Story 5. The Last Rounds. Margaret Holloway had worked at St. Dimphna's Asylum for over 20 years. The facility, tucked away on the edge of a dying town, had long since fallen into disrepair. What had once been a sanctuary for the mentally ill had become a prison, where the walls dripped with neglect and the screams of forgotten souls never truly faded. The night shift was always the worst. The asylum took on a different life when the sun went down. Hallways stretched longer, shadows deepened, and something unseen seemed to shuffle just beyond the periphery of vision. Margaret told herself it was exhaustion, that her mind played tricks on her. But deep down, she knew better. One patient in particular unnerved her the most. Room 316, no one ever spoke his name. Records claimed he had been committed decades ago, yet he remained, never aging, never changing. His file contained nothing but a single word, written over and over again in different hands. Listen. Margaret had never seen him eat, never heard him speak. His face was always turned to the corner of the room, his gaunt frame rigid as stone. She tried to ignore the way his head would tilt slightly whenever she entered, like he was listening. Waiting. One stormy night, the power flickered. The halls of St. Dimphna's were swallowed in darkness. Margaret gripped her flashlight tightly, the beam trembling as she made her rounds. When she reached room 316, she hesitated. The door was ajar. A sharp whisper slithered through the crack. Finally. Her breath hitched. She should have turned back, called for security, but something compelled her forward. Slowly, she pushed open the door. The patient was gone. The room was empty, except for the smell, an overwhelming stench of decay. Margaret's light flickered, revealing the walls scrawled with words. Listen, 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 listen. Then she heard it. Not a sound from outside, not the distant hum of the failing lights, but a whisper that curled into her ear like a lover's breath. It spoke her name. She turned, and he was there. Not just in front of her, but everywhere. His face, twisted and elongated, filled every reflection, every window, every polished surface. Dozens of mouths moved in unison, speaking in a voice that was neither human nor beast. You weren't supposed to hear. Pain lanced through her skull. She fell to her knees as the voices screamed inside her head, filling every corner of her mind. She saw visions of past nurses who had found room 316 empty, of their bodies contorted in agony, of their blank eyes staring at nothing. Margaret clawed at her ears, but the voices wouldn't stop. They never did. The next morning, orderlies found her standing in room 316, staring at the corner, motionless. She never spoke again. The asylum continued its routine. but something had changed. The patients whispered about Margaret now, their vacant eyes shifting whenever she passed. The shadows clung to her more tightly, and the air around her seemed unnaturally still. At night, staff began hearing faint murmurs in the halls when no one was there. Doors locked on their own. The intercom system occasionally crackled to life, playing static-filled recordings of Margaret's last rounds. In room 316, it remained empty, but no one dared enter again. Months later, when a new nurse was hired to replace Margaret, she was given her old locker. Inside, she found a single yellowed note. It's still listening. The next day, the new nurse resigned without explanation. Others followed. St. Dymphna's was forced to shut down entirely, abandoned to its own ghosts. But even after the doors were locked and the asylum was left to decay, passers-by swore they could still hear it. The whisper of Margaret's voice, trapped in the walls, endlessly repeating the same chilling word, listen. Story 6. St. Vincent's Asylum had always housed the most broken souls, the ones no other institution could handle. It sat on the edge of a crumbling cliffside, battered by relentless winds, its stone walls blackened by time. To those who worked there, it was a place of duty. To those who lived there, it was a place of nightmares. Dr. Elias Thurman had seen many patients pass through St. Vincent's, each with their own darkness, but there was one who stood apart from the rest. A man with no name, no records, and no past. He had been found wandering a road several miles away, clad in nothing but a hospital gown, his hands and arms covered in deep, self-inflicted scars. They called him Patient 438. From the moment he arrived, the asylum changed. At first it was small things, the flickering lights, the static-filled intercom crackling in the dead of night. But soon it became more sinister. Patients reported hearing whispers in their rooms, voices urging them to do unspeakable things. Orderlies spoke of shadows moving without source, and the scent of something rotten would drift through the halls without explanation. Dr. Thurman had been assigned to 438's case, tasked with uncovering the truth. He approached the man cautiously, clipboard in hand, pen poised. The patient sat stiffly in his chair, his hollow eyes fixed on something unseen. He never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, his words were cryptic. "What is your name?" the doctor asked. The patient's lips twitched. "Names don't matter here." "Where are you from?" A pause. Then a smile that sent a chill up the doctor's spine. "I don't think you'd like to know." Over the following weeks, Dr. Thurman kept meticulous notes. He documented the strange occurrences, the violent episodes of other patients coinciding with the times he visited 438, the way doors would slam shut on their own when he entered the ward. He watched as nurses grew pale and thin, as though something unseen was feeding off them. One night, desperate for answers, he entered the patient's room alone. 438 was sitting cross-legged on the bed, his fingers tracing patterns on the sheets. The doctor hesitated, a growing unease curling around his thoughts. "What are you?" he asked. For the first time, the patient looked directly at him. His irises were black as oil, swallowing the dim light entirely. The room grew unbearably cold. "You already know," the patient whispered. Dr. Thurman tried to move, but his body refused to obey. An invisible weight pressed down on him, forcing him to his knees. The whispers filled the room, overlapping, merging into a single deafening scream. And in the darkness behind 438, something moved. Something vast, something that should not be. The asylum's alarms blared, lights flickering wildly. By the time security burst into the room, 438 was gone. Only Dr. Thurman remained, curled in the fetal position, his mind shattered. St. Vincent's shut down a month later. The remaining staff refused to speak of what had happened, and those who had spent too much time with the nameless patient vanished without a trace. To this day, travelers passing the ruins claim they hear whispers on the wind, calling them toward the broken asylum, calling them by name, and some, regrettably, listen.